Okay, today we're going to leave the clean, hypodermic era of the 19th and 20th century studio and head off into the more chaotic and socially challenged studios of the painters of that era. Before we begin, I guess you will be asking me probably why, if this is a course on the 20th century, are we starting with late 19th century painting? It's because it pretty much was the foundation against which change occurred. If you're going to understand how radical a movement Futurism and later Dadaism and the photo secession and everything is, you sort of have to see with what was going on here too. Because the painting was the sort of the standard that it was matched against. Painting and the classical academy were the standards of that day, and from which both artists and later society rebelled. And so that whole process is something that you need to see start out here. So that's why I'm going to take you very quickly, and I mean quickly, through a few movements of this era. I've given you some key points about those movements as well. I again say this is not an art history course because I'm running very rapidly through here. We're just going to give you the sort of stepping stone history of the art at the time. But to give you some sense of what's going on, because when that change hits us in the 20th century, it's going to be very dramatic. So that's the way it pretty much starts out. The school of naturalism went all the way back to even the 16th and 17th century. Painters trying to, of course, have a great fidelity to nature, to show what was the natural landscape, because that, of course, was where truth was at the time. And so that evolved into other sources, such as luminism, particularly something like Frederick Church's Icebergs, which, by the way, is at the Dallas Museum of Fine Art if you ever want to see this. It's a huge painting in which basically the naturalistic landscape almost adopted a sort of glow, somewhat akin to, in your digital realm right now, hyperrealism. The colors were a bit more beyond just the natural world and sort of had their own sort of shine and sheen to them, especially when they were well lighted. Naturalism also had other different schools, the chief one of which was the Barbizon school. Millet especially was a man who was akin to depicting the natural world. He was one of the first to really bring the working people into it, to sort of show the fact that not everything was high society or genre or things like that, that there were actually working classes, but at the same time he has a certain honorable naturalness to them, a sort of heroic quality to the work. All of which evolves in sort of the same era as the Academy. The Academy was the standard, and when I show you a list of names from these, I mean, I'm not going to show you each painter or anything like that, but just to give you some names that are readily identifiable. These will, of course, all these slides you're going to have today will be on the website too, so you don't have to write down every name and date on them or anything like that. If you ask me what the death date is of Delacroix, I couldn't tell you. And so it's important to sort of see what the Academy was about, though, because this was the standard. This was the established school of art. It was set up over a period of centuries, and it was sort of almost an old boys club. It had rules, it had dues, social events, officers, even physical locations with rooms, studios, libraries, exhibit spaces, bars in some instances too. It had a sort of institutional legitimacy, and that sort of lent it a certain formal air, a certain high-class air, a certain conservative air to the styles of work that were coming about. You had to be voted in as a member, and there was something that was going to be very much traditional about it. I always liked the later critics who wrote that the academies were more concerned with making a career, not making art. When you see the work, you will see it pretty much established along certain genre themes, pretty much historical themes, if you will, safe themes, if you will. The reign of the philosopher king in the academy in Greece, for example. This one has a particular draw to our senior professor, since he's in logic and everything too. But beyond that, just the things like the arts and literature honoring the king and all the wisdom that comes with the age. It's also set up in a certain traditional pattern. The classic triangle in painting was something that was a formalism from as far back as Raphael in the 16th and 15th century. But these were things that evolved in the work too. You will see it in the work of other painters too. And the nude was very safe at this time as long as it was a classical subject. So that the birth of Venus is profoundly illustrated in this period, time and time again by many painters of the era. So much so that Daumier, writing a satirical engraving in 1850, once has two very highfalutin ladies of French society going, the caption for this is, "Oh no, not another Venus." So, point of satire as well. You were getting saturated with certain things even back then. But the rebellion was going to start a little bit later. The realist school also came about in sort of a reaction, a revolt against that Academy's Romanticism. It wasn't a great revolution, but it was a significant one. It derived its thoughts from Descartes and Locke, those philosophers who thought that the truth should be discovered through the senses rather than through any sort of formalist theme. There was a faith in sort of that objective reality, what you saw before your eye. And you don't want to distort that with things like feeling and emotionalism, personal bias, thoughts like that. There was that effect of the Industrial Revolution that made it a bit more attention to modern, though it was not modernism yet by any means. And the styles were rougher and somewhat less delicate palette. It took its theme from one of the great writers of the time, Charles Baudelaire, who said that artists should be of their own time. You don't want to paint history. You don't want to paint people who are long dead you've never seen. You don't want to paint these classical themes. You want to paint what's now, what's the experience of the real world. And so you went out into the fields and photographed such people as people working in rock quarries. The farm was always a good, safe subject. There were always sort of these naturalists to the things. I always show as sort of a marker in this area this painting by Edouard Manet, which is called The Bar at the Folie Bergere. It was done in 1882, and it was quite notable of its time. There are certain things about it that I would like to show you, because whenever you approach a work of art, you want to go into it in some depth. And this is a very good example for that sort of thing. This is the sort of thing that's going to lead into the Impressionist movement, as you will too. Manet, in fact, is sometimes grouped with the Impressionists. He would, I think, be a little shocked by that, but nonetheless, he's sort of a keystone in that very change in the 1880s and the 1870s from that period. And he would have no objection to them, I think, as well. He was certainly interested in the movement since it came about the decade before. This painting was done in 1882. Manet died of syphilis in 1883, so this is one of his last great works. It depicts, as its title is, the bar at the Folie Bergere. What's the subject of this painting?
Bartender.
What?
The bartender.
The bartender, okay. The colloquial expression at the time was barmaid, but yeah, you're right about that. What is it about her?
Her attitude.
What's her attitude?
It's kind of like, you don't really matter, I'm just here trying to make money.
Okay, acceptable. So you read something in the apathetic, something you read into the expression as well. And yet what is surrounding her?
Fancy people.
This is the Folie Bergere. This was the great scene of nightlife in Paris starting in the 1860s and 1870s and actually going into the early 20th century. This was where you came to see the floor show. This is where you came to see the dancers and the provocative acts and the jugglers and what have you. This was sort of your movie house of the day and where you went for a good time. Anything else about it? She's at the, go ahead, what? Either one.
Okay. I find it kind of strange that she seems so high class, but she seems kind of, doesn't seem happy. It's kind of like the painting Maid of Honor from Velasquez, like the Baroque time period a little bit earlier.
Okay. Yeah.
I was going to say that a lot of the lighting is different than we used before because it's much more like spotty and the lot is on the lighting and how things are lit, such that you see in the background the chandelier is very prominent, and the glasses have a lot of spotlights on them.
Okay. Go ahead.
She looks like she's on sale as much as like the bottles around her. Like even the shape of the bottles kind of echoes her like shapeliness, I guess.
I hadn't read that one before. That's an interesting observation. Yes, she has champagne, and they've even people who dissected this and said that these beer bottles here are harp beer. Why are British beer bottles in a painting of a French bar by a French painter? Those sort of things are very important, very symbolic. Manet, if you also knew him, painted a lot of nudes, painted a lot of prostitutes. And in all his paintings with prostitutes, he always had a bowl of oranges somewhere, or some orange theme that carried out with it too, at reference to it as well. Let me ask also, what about her background? If this was a bar, what's usually behind a bar? Yes. So your point of view.
Is our point of view the guy?
Very good. You've left one ahead of me, and that's good. Yeah. We are looking at her across the bar into the wall, which has a big mirror on it. So what does that mean we're doing in this painting?
We're getting to by we're talking to
Or we are participating in that nightlife that is going on behind us to our backs. We are part of that demi-monde society, if you will, of Paris at the time. We are playing that role as well. Why then, let's put it this way, who's she talking to? Us. Is that her reflection? How many say yes and how many say no? How many say yes? How many say no? How many have no opinion?
It looks small. It is all that.
Okay. That question is still debated to this day, and art historians get into a nice big fight about it. A physicist in the early part of this century actually set up a whole model in studio and proved how, with a certain curvature to the mirror, that could in fact be the observer if you wanted to. Other people say no, that man represented in there is actually standing next to you, the viewer. Most agree that that is her reflection. Some people, however, still have the theory that it is not, that it is another barmaid with her back to you. Manet consciously made this a conflicting image so you to get that feeling. But he does want you to feel a part of that participation. You could in fact be the part of that young gentleman of the evening, that young gay, using the old 19th century colloquialism of gay blade in the demi-monde world of Paris at the time, who's there approaching a barmaid. There was also, if you read the social columns of the day, a good place to pick up ladies of the evening were barmaids who worked at the various clubs at the time. So there is all that indictment too, which is further emphasized by the fact that she has a big flower bouquet at her breast, which is symbolic of that as well. The point I would make in this is not that there is necessarily one interpretation of any painting or any photograph you see. There are many. You are called upon to not only look at the painting, but to look into it. To not only look, if you will, but also to see. To go into the depth of it and see what you impressed with it and see like that. There is no one answer to this. That is the complexity that Manet and others of his generation were working with, and that is going to become even more complex as we get into the paintings and the photographs of the 20th century. But this is the way you can certainly read and react to paintings. So if some of you do your papers on literature and art, please be aware that your opinion and your reaction to it matter, rather than there being any one particular answer. Yes?
If that really is her reflection, and how you said how this painter talked or really drew prostitutes and you had oranges, it just kind of looks like she's, to her it feels like, okay, this is just another man who's gonna take me, because that could be a wealthy man because he has a top hat and he has a beard, so it could be he's asking her.
Could be.
So
It
that's
well
why
be.
I figure like she's a
That is,
prostitute.
and that is one of the general ways that art historians have thought about this painting too. So yeah, it can have a whole social indictment, social criticism within its content as well. It doesn't just have to be a pretty painting of gay nightlife. So there's all sorts of things like that to consider in a painting like this. If you do ever any time, though, do look it up on the web. There is one that the physicist who set up the mirrors in the model and tried to depict exactly whether or not that was a reflection. It's a pretty clever little study anyway. All this, of course, was leading to Impressionism. And Manet was somebody who celebrated on the tail end of his life. And this is the big bunch. You've seen a lot of these names before. Impressionism was a style that evolved definitely in reaction to the Academy and the salons. The emphasis was on effect rather than on line, on form. And there was this great fascination with light, with motion, with reflection, with movement. And that was supposed to make an impression on the eye rather than a scientific depiction or recording of the world. Color was also something that played a vital point in all these sort of work. And generally speaking, the work, of course, also celebrated the everyday rather than the great historical moment or the significant action of the upper classes. It was something that was not afraid to sink its teeth into the vibrancy of life. This, by the way, is an earlier Manet painting, but it was also one that is sort of marked as a heralding point towards Impressionism. The Impressionists were actually formed in revolt to the Academy at the time. They approached them to participate in the Salon of 1872. The Salon people were aghast at the work they were being seen by these radicals, and so they wouldn't let them in. So they moved down the block to the photographer named Nadar, who was a critical 19th century photographer who had a big gallery because he was a successful portraitist. And he said, sure, bring on the paintings. And so in a photographer's studio in 1872, the first Salon of the Impressionists was held. The reaction to the public, as you can see from a contemporary cartoon, was less than calm. Such is the work with it. And from that work became the reaction. The image that is sort of credited with having started that revolution was done in 1872 by Claude Monet. And it's simply called Impression Sunrise. It's a painting of the harbor at Le Havre. And it was very typical of the Impressionist work that was starting at this time, was going to be a serious foundation for it. We sort of get an idea, an impression, if you will, that this is boats on water. We can see dabs of color, flashes of color to sort of get the twinkling of the water. We can get a sense that there are boats back there. We have a subdued sun and a bright red sky. And all these sort of things go into our feeling of what's there. But it's not a fine line. It's not semi-photographic in look or anything like that. Monet wrote about this at the time. His landscape is nothing but an impression, an instantaneous one, hence its label that was given us, by the way, because of me. I sent a thing done in Le Havre from my window, sun in the mist, and a few masts of boats sticking up in the foreground. They asked for a title for the catalog. It couldn't really be taken as a view of Le Havre, and I said, put impression. The reaction, by and large, the reviews were pretty negative. Louis Leroy, writing in Le Charity, impression, I was certain of it. I was just telling myself that since I was impressed, there had to be some impression in it, and what freedom, what ease of workmanship. Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than the seascape. Yeah, take that and that and that. Okay. Anyway, the Impressionists, however, were not to be denied, and they led to a series of movements based upon their work afterwards. You see this coming along in the 1880s and 1890s and even into the curve of the century. People like Cezanne painting, who was one of the key figures at the time. Less perhaps daubs here than you will, but still sort of a distortion of what's there. Things don't react in a natural scientific way. Look at the edge of the table, which starts out here and goes under this tablecloth and suddenly is down here at this angle. Or look at the fact that the bowl of fruit, rather than holding it like any normal still life, almost looks like it's going to spill it on the floor. He was looking for just a new way of seeing forms and a new way of fitting them in, rather than a literal interpretation of the world he was seeing. Seurat, in his pointillistic work, this paint and this canvas, when you look at it very closely, is nothing but little dots and dabs of paint to give that sort of effect that Seurat was going for. And of course, most of you know Van Gogh from one way or another. people have seen this amazing work. If you ever see a real painting up front, you can really get a dynamic sense of what a brilliant visionary he was. There are people, however, who still debate to this day that he had something like astigmatism or something wrong with his eyes, that he was recording the night sky like this. I don't think so, but anyway. This is not limited to France. There are other reactions to the same classical academies at the time going on. In Germany and in the Middle European countries was Secessionism. Secessionism adopted a more pessimistic view of life. They were concerned with anxiety, despair. There are all sorts of symbols of death in the pictures. Torture both within, but especially without too. The fact that you could beat a tortured soul was something that was significant. And I always point to the Freud fact that in his first examination of suicide, he first used the term subconscious. Subconscious, of course, being one of the key words to what was going to happen in art, and indeed all society in the 20th century. There's a certain flattening as well, and humanity is very much in crisis. Take a picture by Klimt, for example. You really don't want to invite these people to your mixer. But that was considered a serious comment on society and culture at the time. This is a night party done by Schiele, which looks like not so much as an outtake from The Walking Dead. I don't know. That sort of work that was being done in 1900, 1910. Or, of course, the most famous one amongst The Scream, which is also from that period, too. To give you an idea of how this reaction was done to society. Contrary to this, in France was an almost overabundance of naturalistic work in some sense with Art Nouveau. It was more illustrative, it was more decorative. It was really concerned with organic form, with the way plants were, with the way the curvature was, and you could apply those sort of forms to all sorts of subjects, not just the plants and flowers. You know, the celebration of Sarah Bernhardt's play, for example, or of course the key figure, Toulouse-Lautrec. This is his painting rather of a poster for the ball at the Moulin Rouge at the time. It even was adapted to architecture and to styles of interior design. Fauvism appeared also at the same time. This was very much a color revolution. You were actually, as one writer put it, living in the country of color. The forms were vivid, they were glorious. They were non-illusionistic. You could see what they were about. They weren't abstract, but they were also life-affirming too. They were not, however, natural colors. The colors were applied in a way to set a tone, to set a feeling, to set an identifiable space as well. So that when Matisse and others got a hold of it, the fact that it became such. In real life, you don't have a green brow and nose. In real life, the background probably is not broken up in such bright colors. But that is the way the work could be done with the Fauvists. Or this picture of a red room with a landscape outside. Very flat, very angular in some respects, but overall very dynamic in terms of the color. It's the color that floats this off the canvas. Well, all this is, of course, leading to the big revolution, which is modernism. You will see that people like Matisse and Duchamp appear out of the earlier schools and into modernism as well. Modernism was something, and perhaps this picture by Matisse more than others really depicts it so well. The lines are not fine, they're very rough. It's a very soft edge to the work. The palette is glorious with color. It is in no way a naturalistic color, or at least I hope the model did not have a green and orange and purple face as well. And yet he uses that so well to add vibrancy and life to what the look of this work is going to be. Modernism was the big revolution to the classical academy, as well as to that naturalism, all those things that were happening in the 19th century. By the time of century's turn, were becoming very important. Yes, it evolved from scientific and industrial evolution, but it rejected that formalism. What counted was you as the individual artist, the way you were to express yourself. So there is that conflict between the freedom and the will. What should be done, what should be dealt with. And all that came to be reflected not just in painting, not just in photography, but in all the fine arts. This was also the revolution in music, in dance, in theater, was beginning at this time too. Probably the biggest poet of the period of that time, the man who really was the voice for modernism, was Guillaume Apollinaire. You've read his piece for this class, for the last class. He was a friend of the modernists. He tried his hand at painting, didn't do so well, but he was a big poet. He did like to write his poems. One of the styles that he particularly adapted, which is very interesting, was something called the calligram, where he would do his poems based on a photograph or based on a drawing and shape them, sometimes with script, sometimes with type. It was very interesting. It was a visual form of what was a written language. I can't say it didn't catch on too well, but it was something that he tried. Above all, however, he hung out with the modernists at the time. He would write reviews. He would do PR for them. He would publicize their work. He was the big voice for them. Without his help, people like Picasso and Braque would not have made what they made. Cubism, of course, is probably the most predominant form. It's important to note that Cubism was so radical that it made a great impression despite the fact that it wasn't up that long. It came along about 1907, 1908, and was probably dying out before the First World War. But it is the basis for all that sort of radical revolution that was there. You could begin to do something so that painting represented an idea of something rather than the thing itself. What Gertrude Stein said about it, you paint what you know is there, not what you can see. It relied upon your intelligence, your reaction to that world, and everything became very angular, very schematic, often brutal in depiction and deception. Above all else, it was not a literal interpretation. It relied on your vision of what the world was going to be like. I can talk about that to great length, but let me show you a modern example so you get a sense of what that's like. This is one of Dan's favorite paintings too, by the way. So, but anyway, more to go to the master, however. This is Picasso's self-portrait done in the Cubist style. The revolutionary painting which first called this was his famous Demoiselles d'Avignon, a painting of 5 Barcelona prostitutes that he did in 1907, 1908. This was not the birth of Venus that you saw from the classical school. These ladies are prostitutes. You can tell by the fruit that's symbolic in the work as well as by their attire, and also by the almost confrontational way they face you. But it's a diffracted style. These are not gorgeous curves. These are angular pieces. And 2 of these ladies have heads that are based upon African masks, and the other 3 are staring right at you. You are the clinical subject. You know, if you're going to go to a house of prostitution, these are not going to be voluptuous ladies waiting to see you. These are ladies who are ready to take your dime, do their duty, and get you out the door for the next job. This was the sort of attitude that Picasso wanted to bring to his work, the harsh reality of the world done in his view of life. Even more classical subjects look that way. Braque's painting of a guitarist, for example. You can sort of get the hint of the shape of the form and the stringed instrument in there, but it is in no way a literal piece in any way, shape, or form. Or Jean Metzinger. Metzinger is a very interesting guy for the Cubist period, because Metzinger actually started out as a Fauvist. He would follow from school to school. He's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is the fact that Apollinaire wrote about this painting that Metzinger did of him in 1910, in which Apollinaire claimed this was the first Cubist painting. I have a little bit of problem with calling it a Cubist painting. It still owes a lot to Fauvism, but at the same time, it was something that Apollinaire was heralding. And so for this period between 1907 and 1908, when Picasso was letting the world see Cubism, up until World War I, this was the type of work that was seen. This is a bit later Metzinger. This is shortly before the war. But again, that sort of Cubist style of breaking down the real world in that sort of fashion. What else was going on in the continent? German Expressionism. Kircher, Nodal were forming a group called The Bridge in 1905. and they render the inner convictions that they knew and do so with spontaneity and sincerity is one of us. That is what you do if you do become a member of this group. Figures are fragmented, and it becomes more of an emotional, less of an intellectual experience. You're moving closer here to the pure abstract world, even more so than the Cubists in many manners. One of Nolde's paintings of people he's passing on the street in Berlin. Not flattering to society at all. You're reading the inner people, and you're doing it in a very cynical, very harsh way. But this is leading to probably the key component of modernism, which was abstraction. The pioneer of the spirit of this was Kandinsky. If you ever get a chance, do read On the Spiritual and Art, which he published in 1912, which is his Bible. Kandinsky adopted any attempt to get rid of depiction of the real world. And he emphasized with the Blue Group the fact that imagery should now be non-representational. It is spiritual. It is entirely what you feel. You are not obligated to depict anything in the world around you. Color, I very much like the analogy, is like music. You find beauty in the interrelationships of tones and intensities, and pure feelings are removed from that physical context. Take a look, for example. You don't try and search in this kind of painting for a depiction of a person or a depiction of a guitar or a picture of a nude or anything like this. This is an entire expression of will that he did at the time for this sort of work. And it is in some ways very much reminiscent of the reaction to music. It's pretty important that jazz was starting to make an appearance about this time too. In fact, if we ever expand this course to include things like theater and music, we're going to have to put music behind these different patterns. Jazz is the one I would put behind this. Well, finally we get to what Dan's been hinting at, the Futurists. Boccioni, Balla, and others. But it begins with Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. You've read the Manifesto of Futurist Painters? Well, that is noted by that nostalgia for the past equaling failure of nerve. You owe no allegiance to the past, and in fact, quite the opposite. You owe a flat rebellion to it. You don't take it seriously. It is your enemy. Your confidence and optimism is only in the modern, only to the future. Technology, certainly, especially as it applies to things like speed and energy, and diffraction of light. Change is the very key of it. A couple of quotes that I've always thought sum this up very well. The oldest among you are not yet 30. Of us are not yet 30. We have at least 10 years to accomplish our task. When we're 40, yet younger and stronger men than we, throw us in the wastebasket like useless manuscripts. In other words, right now, you guys, you're breaching your 20s. You don't have long to make your impact in the futurist world. After that, when you hit 40, you're going to be thrown away. They will crowd around us, panting with anguish and disappointment, and exasperated by our proud, indefatigable courage, will hurl themselves forward to kill us. With all the more hatred that their hearts will be drunk with love and admiration of us. And strong, healthy injustice will shine radiant from their eyes. For art can only be violence, cruelty, injustice. A futurist painting by Balla. What do you see there? Pardon?
I said cruelty and justice.
Cruelty and justice. What else? Any impression you get with this?
Seems really loud.
What?
Seems really loud.
Loud, okay.
Reminds me of like the prism like of light.
Prism of light, okay.
I feel like I'm going down a time warp or something. Where all the lines that there prayers and left there.
Okay.
Shattered? It looks like it's shattered.
Shattered? Yes?
I see a lot of motion and a lot of vibrancy in it. A lot of energy.
Have you taken art history before?
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
Well,
that's also what I see.
good. This is the era of the Model T, the 1913 and thereabout. This is a painting of a car, by Balla. It's meant to just give you that impression of speed, of forward motion, of light, binding off that division is there.
The time warp towards the future with that color.
What?
Yeah, you're warping towards the future.
Okay, working towards the future. Let's try one more for you, okay? How about this one? Light bulb?
I think it's like
Who said light bulb? Very good. Two over there. Okay, 2 light bulbs. What else? Moon. Lamp post. Of course, what happened at the end of the 19th century? Electricity, right, exactly. So this, who said street light? Because that's what it is. Very good. Yeah, this is his depiction of a street light. Some people have read this as a sort of cyclops-like skull. Other people seem to think of it as some sort of explosion. If you tell that to a futurist, they would love you. They would think, yes, it's very good. But yes, the title of it is basically street lamp. So it's interesting. That sort of thing is what the futurists are, and they did leave, painting was not the only thing they did. They got involved with photography too. Bala as well was doing this sort of thing too, implying motion. Well, at the time in photography, if you moved, this was considered an error, so you just threw the print away. But for them, this was an expression again of that sort of sense of instability and diffraction, modernism that's there for you. So the futurists were having that impact as well at this time. All this is going to lead us next in 2 weeks to Dada. And when you get to Dada, you will see, I think, the next extension from what the futurists were doing. It was all leading up to this real massive break. This sort of, I love the poster for the exhibit, we, no, yes, no, sort of thing which is going on there. It will also lead us to modernism and will take us back across the ocean to America and to what was going on here in the 1910s and 1920s. Before I do that, let me take you briefly on photography's road to modernism. Because photography is going on at the same time with the painters. You think it was something for the fact that the Academy not to let the Impressionists in? Well, in the 1860s, photography had to get into the Academy too. And here's humble photography with his portfolio ringing the bell, asking to be seen. And here it is, of course, being violently rejected by the painters. Photography can't be art, kick it out. Certain things are shaping photography at this turn of the century too. Technology especially. Photography is moving away from that elite and into a mass media culture. There's the halftone, there's press photography. Picture postcards are becoming popular in every store. Stereographs are selling more and more. We are now getting, with the electric light, able to make significant realms in the field of enlarging pictures. We don't have to make a print just the size of the negative by contact printing. We can now put it in an enlarger and light it up and make it bigger. The growth of the photo industry also came along this time too, and those are all sorts of innovations from the hand camera, roll film, to flash. So that this, for example, is a picture of a street view in New York of a pretzel salesman in the 1890s. If you notice the dot pattern, that's the halftone. This is taken out of a book of the period. The dot pattern simply lets you take a black and white photograph and reduce it to black and white dots, which when you then combine them and print it on the page, could give you the halftones that you saw. This was a revolution in printing. It made printing cheaper, it made it much more flexible, it got more pictures out to the public on the printed page. The stereo view, we've shown you stereos in the first talk, but they really began to proliferate at this time. By the turn of the century, every classroom was supposed to have a stereo viewer. It was important in its day as having a VCR is now, or back then, or then a DVD or whatever you're doing right now. Enlargements. Yes, you can put a picture in an enlarger and make a bigger picture. The portability of work became much more rapid too. You were no longer tied to heavy equipment in the old style. You now could carry all your camera equipment and film simply in one hand and have the other hand free to smoke. The instantaneousness of photography was there. By the 1880s and 1890s, when the films got faster and the speeds got faster, you turn a page in a magazine, you like to see a picture of people jumping over something somewhere. The industry that developed was, of course, massive at this time because now people could get in hands with their photographs. It tied into other social factors. Bicycling was a big fad in the 1890s, and so was combining photography with bicycling. I really wish that device had existed to this day. I would love to see how it worked completely. But anyway, and of course, color came along, and with it, the first attempts at any sort of popularization of color. The big revolution in 1888, George Eastman and the first roll film camera. No longer did you have dry plates or glass plates. You now had film on a flexible base that was transparent, that was firm enough to hold it, that you could roll up your pictures in a tight roll and put it in a camera. And so in 1888 came the first Kodak. You wound it around here through the little slit, which yes, it had a circular look, and back around the other side, you put it in that box. All you had to do was pull the string at the top, aim it at what you want to take a picture of, and press the button. And then you mailed the whole camera back to Kodak. They processed your film, reloaded it, and sent it back to you. An ad. The line that was famous with Kodak was, of course, you press the button and we do the rest. Not only, therefore, was an industry established on a new portable camera that made it available for most everybody, but an entire industry that was involved with the creation of the processing material, too. Eastman made a fortune. He made a killing. And this is an example, again, this picture of Queen Victoria was taken with that first Kodak. You can see what those circular faces look like. If you find that circular masking in any print, old print, anywhere that you find, nowadays it's very rare. Art photography developed along certain lines as well. The naturalistic photography, of course, was conclusive at the same time with the motion of the painting schools of naturalism also. People like Carlton Watkins took his glass plates into Yosemite in the 1870s and 1880s, photographed Yosemite for the first time, brought the pictures back to the East Coast, and helped establish the national park system by showing the people on the East Coast what the views on the West Coast looked like. That print, by the way, is some 20 inches by 24 inches. It's a huge negative he used to make it. The naturalist school in England was done as well. People would get out and simply take a single plane of focus, which had out-of-focus lands on both ends of it too, to sort of see like the eye would see. Pictorialism was an attempt to actually define itself in terms of pictures, in terms of paintings. That denial of that industrialization, the mass process work. You do your work by hand. You use photomechanical processes rather than photographic processes. Divide it down to ink on paper. You get flatter tones, but you get more sort of painterly-like looking images. H.P. Robinson at the turn of the century was doing these sort of elaborate collages. There's about, I think, 9 photographs in this one image that were then cut up, rejoined together, and pasted into one big print. The male and female models were photographed on different days. They never met. And others used, again, the romantic themes of the Catskill Academy, but others were a bit more modernist in their looks. Edward Steichen, who we will meet again, first had his beginnings in pictorialism, and as we'll see later when we get to the 30s, completely changed his style. You evolved from one school to another. There was anthropological pictorialism, which ostensibly was about the subject matter of culture or society, but it ended up being more representational and factually accurate. The key champion of this was Edward Curtis, who in 1906 set about photographing the North American Indian. He did this project for some 25 years. He produced 20 bound books and 20 portfolios of prints. It's a massive production that he did. So big, in fact, that as one critic said, it was so big it buried itself. You only find them in certain museums and certain institutions because you couldn't afford it by that time. But it was significant work. It was dynamic portraiture, and even the landscapes had a certain pictorial effect too. Not entirely technically accurate, but still certainly radical for its day in celebrating the American Indian. And urbanization. You're going to find that with modernism anyway, with the city. so that you will find the city treated in many different ways. Charles Dudley Arnold photographed the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. The, 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovering America. So they built a big World's Fair on the shores of Lake Michigan. They redesigned topography. They built these huge buildings, not as they might look to you out of marble or stone. These are all wood frames with wire and plaster on them, so that all these buildings were temporary. After the fair closed in 1894, it all rotted away and was torn down. The modern city was depicted more by people who had a sensibility towards seeing what was there, to take it more in a naturalistic style. They used hand cameras, yes, they used Kodak cameras, but they could take pictures that were very interesting at the time. Paul Martin in the late 1890s and early 1900s photographed street views, but he would show them in context with the street. Popular in the day was not this sort of view, but this sort of view, where he would actually move out the background and make what he called a living statue. Now, of course, our context is to want them more like this. And Alfred Stieglitz, who we will also meet next time, who championed the photo-secessionist movement, where the city became a backdrop for form, light, structure, ideals, rather than a documentation of buildings. How many photographers, even in the 1910s and 1920s, photographed piers instead of buildings? And finally, the camera used for social reform. A number of the social movements of the time, Mrs. Broom, the first woman press photographer at the turn of the century in Britain, who, along with all the other men press photographers, photographed the activities that were going on in Britain at the time, including, ironically, the women's suffrage movement. How the other half lives, Jacob Riis at the turn of the century in America, who took his camera with a flash powder into the settlements and poverty areas of New York and photographed the poor, the immigrants, in a campaign to try and change their lives, and reproduce those images in his books, in his tracts, to try and change society. Something that was taken up 2 decades later by Louis Hine, who photographed in such a radical way, in such an important way, that he ended up revolutionizing the child labor laws in this country. Science and photography, there's our Italian people again. The big thing was motion. Next time we're going to get into movies, but this was the experimentation that occurred. Muybridge photographing the horse with all its feet off the ground. The motion of Bala and others in the movement. Dan showed you this picture. The cinema and film that was beginning seriously at the time. We have now reached that stage where we've left the world of Sherlock Holmes, the trust of the fact of the image, and begun to see the eye of the photographer. George Bernard Shaw, our old pal, wrote in 1901, "If you cannot see at a glance that the old game is up, that the camera has hopelessly beaten the pencil and paintbrush as an instrument of artistic representation, and you will never make a true critic. You are only, like most critics, a picture fancier." Take that, everybody. Picasso at the time in 1909 got high on hashish one evening and declared, as for Picasso in a state of nervous hysteria, he shouted he discovered photography, that he wanted to kill himself, he had nothing left to learn. Thank God he didn't. We will get into war next time because that turns us into the 20th century and those other movements. Thank you.